Alright everyone, so I have finally lived to see it. Someone is arguing from a supposedly libertarian perspective that drug prohibition is a positive thing. This article is written by a Timothy, and I can't pronounce his last name, my apologies, but this article is filled with thinly veiled authoritarian ideas that are trying to be passed off as somehow libertarian. So the first point where this author goes wrong is when he claims that in order to be free, one must have their rationality intact. And since drugs destroy rational thinking, drugs undermine your liberty, and therefore the state needs to step in and throw you into a cage for using these drugs. Now, one of the first glaring problems with the core of this author's argument is that he begins his argument at the wrong starting point. He is talking about this hypothetical person who is currently inebriated on some drug, but he completely ignores the necessary condition before someone is intoxicated, which is when they are sober and rational. So you have a sober and rational person making the decision to use a drug or to drink an alcoholic beverage at some point in the future. So that is, by this author's own definition, someone who is exercising their own expression of free will and liberty as a sober and rational human being, and they are expressing that liberty by taking a drug or having some drinks. And to assume that every instance in which someone takes a drug or takes a drink is someone who is imprisoned by addiction is quite the assumption. Right there, sorry Timothy, your argument falls apart. And by the way, it is not always the case either that drugs destroy rational thinking. I've actually heard people on drugs say some strangely insightful things before. Not always, but it has happened. Anyway, I digress. This author then goes on to claim that alcohol prohibition was a good idea too, and lowered the amount of alcohol consumption. First of all, here is research done by the National Bureau of Economic Research that says that alcohol consumption did go down by 30% after prohibition, but then rose sharply by 60 to 70% a few years into prohibition. But even without this research, this author cannot state this as a fact, because after alcohol was made illegal, people began to brew their own gin in their own bathtubs. People began making their own alcohol, and they were understandably a bit secretive about it because they didn't want their lives destroyed for simply engaging in an activity they wanted to engage in. So this author cannot definitively state that alcohol consumption went down. People became far more covert in their drinking during Prohibition. In fact, if you look up studies done on alcohol consumption during Prohibition, the wide consensus is that there's a lot of guesswork going on because of the lack of information. So it simply is disingenuous for this author to state this as a fact. And by the way, I haven't even mentioned yet the innocent people who had nothing to do with alcohol who were killed in the crossfire of rival rum runners and bootleggers, and the only reason why it was profitable for them to be killing and shooting each other was so they could control the black market, which is a direct result from the types of policies that the author of this article is supporting. So I would like to hear from this author. What about those innocent people who were killed during Prohibition? And what about the innocent people who are killed today from drug prohibition? How about their liberties and their lives being taken away because of a situation that only exists because of people like this author? Okay, so back to the core argument this author is making. And the author actually has a brief moment of clarity here in response to someone who would argue that the author has to be in favor of banning fatty foods, for example, or banning soda to remain consistent. Now, these things do not alter one's mind, and therefore they do not fall under the purview of what this author thinks should be banned. I can accept that. That makes sense. But how about adrenaline junkies? There are people who have a personality that I and many other people would consider to be irrational, because they have to hit that button in their brain to get that shot of adrenaline. And they do this by climbing dangerous peaks, mountain biking down dangerous terrain, or putting on a wingsuit and jumping off a cliff and hoping there isn't a small tear in the wings. Let's assume for a moment that these people are in fact less rational. Does that mean that they are somehow less free than you or I, because we might be more rational? That is completely incoherent, and it's a terrible gauge by which to judge how free someone is. A far better gauge of freedom and liberty is how much you have to worry about having a gun pointed at your head because of laws that this author supports. And by the way, those adrenaline junkies engage in high-risk behaviors that could easily lead to serious injury or death. Should we outlaw everything they want to do because of our perception of them as being less rational? Should we turn them into criminals for doing what they want? Because somehow we would be helping them become more free by telling them that we're going to throw them into cages if they engage in an activity that we deem to be irrational? It makes no sense. How about me, for example, me personally? I'm a night owl and I have to get up early even though I've only slept 4 or 5 hours. If I have to drive, I am not as crisp as I could be if I got 8 hours of sleep. Do you want to outlaw my right to sleep 4 or 5 hours a night because I'm not as clear-headed and rational at that moment? Am I more free when I become more alert after a cup of coffee? Do I somehow attain more liberty after having that caffeine? Maybe I am not rational for not sleeping more. That could be possible. Are you going to come in with the strong arm of the law to save me from myself and make sure that I get a good night's sleep? How creepy and authoritarian do you want to take this thing? Anyway, I've spent enough time on this article. I am sorry, Timothy. I understand you were probably trying to be some sort of a contrarian, but it did not seem to work here. Thank you for listening, and that's all.